Rome did not rise into an empty Italy. Before its roads, laws and legions became memory, another civilization shaped cities, trade, tombs, metalwork, and the quiet habits of power across the peninsula. Yet much of what they were is now seen through Roman eyes, buried under Roman language, Roman victory, and Roman inheritance. A people can disappear not only by dying, but by being absorbed into someone else's story. Before Rome, how could an entire civilization rule Italy and then be erased? Long before Rome became the name that later centuries would remember, Italy was not a waiting room for Roman history. It was already a crowded human landscape, shaped by rivers, hills, coastlines, farms, ports, shrines, languages, and small centres of power that looked outward across the sea and inward toward the mountains. In the north, people moved through the Po Valley and its wide river plains. In the centre, communities lived among volcanic hills, wooded ridges, and fertile basins. Along the western coast, ships could approach harbours that connected Italy with the wider Mediterranean world. To the south, Greek-speaking settlers founded cities that carried their own gods, goods, alphabets, and habits of building. None of this belonged to Rome at the beginning. Rome was only one settlement among many, placed near the Tiber, close enough to the sea to trade, but inland enough to be protected. When we imagine early Italy, the first mistake is to draw a straight road leading toward Rome. The older truth is quieter and more complicated. Human beings had been making homes in this peninsula for a very long time, following the same basic needs that have guided our species since deep prehistory: water, shelter, food, paths of movement, and places where memory could be fixed to the ground. By the time Rome began to form its identity, those needs had already produced many local worlds. Some spoke languages related to Latin, some did not. Some left many inscriptions, some left only objects, graves, walls, and traces under the soil. In that mixed setting, the people later called the Etruscans became one of the strongest forces in central Italy. They were not a single, shadowy tribe waiting to be discovered by Rome. They built cities, worked metal, traded across the sea, buried their dead with care, and developed forms of power that impressed, worried, and influenced their neighbours. Their land, often called Etruria, lay mainly between the Arno and the Tiber, but their influence reached beyond one neat boundary. Their cities stood on high ground, near roads, rivers, fields, and mineral resources. They belonged to a world where strength did not always mean one capital ruling everything. Strength could also mean a chain of wealthy cities, each with its own leaders, rituals, workshops, and alliances. This matters because Rome's later story often makes earlier Italy appear smaller than it really was. Roman memory was powerful, and Roman writing survived in large quantities. Once Rome became dominant, many older voices were filtered through Roman language and Roman explanation. A civilization can be pushed aside in this way, without every house burning and without every family vanishing. Its names can remain, while its own account of itself grows thin. Its skills can be inherited, while the people who shaped them become background. This is one reason the Etruscans feel both present and distant. Archaeology shows they were there. Roman tradition admits they mattered, yet their own long voice is mostly missing. That silence should not tempt us to invent easy answers. It should make us move more slowly, looking at landscape, objects, and memory with care. To understand the question of how a civilization before Rome could rule much of Italy and then seem erased, we have to begin with the living map beneath Rome's rise. Italy was not empty soil. It was a meeting place of human groups, adapting to land, sea, trade, danger, and opportunity over many generations. From the beginning of our species, survival has depended not only on strength, but on the ability to learn from place. The Etruscans learned from their place before Rome learned how to command it. And in that older Italy, Rome was not yet the centre of the story. Only one young settlement growing beside a river, surrounded by peoples who already knew how to build a world. The land that allowed Etruscan cities to grow was not rich in one simple way, as if a civilization could rise from a single gift of soil or metal. Central and northern Italy offered a more patient combination of advantages, each one small by itself, but powerful when held together across generations. The western side of the peninsula had a long face turned toward the Tyrrhenian Sea, where sailors from other parts of the Mediterranean could arrive with goods, styles, stories, and useful skills. Behind that coast stood hills of volcanic earth, river valleys, forests, pastures, and mineral zones where copper, iron, and other resources could be worked by hands trained over time. A community that could farm, herd animals, cut timber, mine ore, shape metal, and reach the sea was not trapped inside one kind of life. It could change with need. It could feed itself from the land while also looking outward across water. That balance mattered deeply in early Italy, because human power has often begun where survival needs overlap with movement. Since the earliest human groups, people have followed watercourses, crossed ridges, returned to fertile ground, and turned useful stone, bone, wood, clay, and metal into memory made visible. In Etruria, the landscape gave many chances for that old human habit to become urban life. Rivers such as the Arno and the Tiber helped connect inland settlements with wider routes, while hilltop locations offered defense, visibility, and a sense of control over surrounding fields. The Etruscan cities were not floating ideas. They grew from raised ground, from roads worn by feet and animals, from fields that had to be managed, from harbours that had to be watched, and from workshops where raw materials slowly became tools, weapons, ornaments, vessels, and sacred objects. The shape of the land also encouraged a pattern different from one flat empire ruled from one centre. Hills and valleys allowed strong local identities to form. Each city could look toward its own fields and roads, yet still share language, rituals, artistic forms, and trading connections with others nearby. This helped create a network of related cities rather than a single state with one command. For a time, that network was enough. It allowed wealth to gather in several places at once, making Etruscan influence wide without needing the kind of political unity Rome later developed. The sea added another layer. Across the Mediterranean, people were exchanging pottery, wine, oil, metalwork, letters, religious ideas, and habits of display. Etruscan elites took part in that exchange, not as silent receivers, but as active participants who adapted outside influences to local needs. Greek goods and styles could enter Etruscan tombs and homes, while Etruscan metalwork and other products moved outward. This does not mean their civilization was simply borrowed. Human cultures rarely grow by isolation alone. From our oldest beginnings, learning has often meant taking what arrives from elsewhere and fitting it into the patterns of one's own place. The Etruscans did this in a landscape that rewarded contact. They lived close enough to the sea to trade, close enough to the mountains and mineral lands to produce valuable goods, and close enough to other Italic peoples to compete, imitate, resist, and influence. Rome, still young beside the Tiber, rose inside this larger system. Its later greatness can make the earlier balance hard to see, but the conditions were already there before Rome commanded them. Central and northern Italy had food, routes, raw materials, defensible sites, and contact with the wider world. In that quiet possibility, the old human search for safety slowly became a visible map of power. Those conditions did not guarantee an Etruscan future, and they did not freeze history in their favour. They only made it possible for a civilization before Rome to become strong enough that Rome would later inherit, absorb, and partly bury its traces beneath a different name. If Rome did not begin from emptiness, then the first question is not why Rome became powerful, but what kind of older world made Roman power possible? The answer cannot be reduced to one people, one invention, or one moment. Italy before Rome was a layered human field, where many communities had already tested ways of living with land, water, trade, danger, and memory. The Etruscans stand near the centre of that older field because their cities became strong enough to shape the habits around them. They built on hills, looked toward the sea, worked metal, organised burial grounds, used writing, and joined the exchange routes of the Mediterranean. Yet they were not alone. Latins, Sabines, Umbrians, Greeks in the south, and other neighbouring peoples all belonged to the same broader peninsula. Rome grew among them, not above them at first. Its early world was one of borrowing, pressure, imitation, and rivalry. That is why the title's question has to be handled carefully. To say that a civilization before Rome ruled Italy does not mean that every valley obeyed one Etruscan throne. It means that, before Roman dominance, Etruscan power and culture reached across much of central Italy and beyond, leaving marks strong enough that later Rome could not be understood without them. Their influence touched symbols of authority, urban life, religious practice, engineering habits, and the political imagination of early Rome. But influence is not the same as simple control, and history becomes less honest when it turns complex power into a single dramatic claim. From the oldest human beginnings, groups have survived by learning from those already present nearby. No community starts with a blank mind. A settlement inherits paths, tools, words, fears, crops, animals, stories, and techniques from older generations. Rome was no different. The city beside the Tiber was born into a human environment already dense with experience. Its people did not invent urban Italy from nothing. They rose in a peninsula where others had learned how to turn geography into status and status into lasting institutions. The Etruscans helped create that inherited world, even when the later Roman story made them appear like a preface rather than a full civilization. This is where the idea of erasure begins to change shape. Erasure is not always a sudden silence. Sometimes it is a change in which language names the past. Sometimes it is the survival of a ritual after the old explanation is gone. Sometimes it is a road, a symbol, a wall, or a ceremony continuing under a new flag. By the time Rome expanded, older Etruscan cities did not simply vanish from the earth. People remained. Families adapted. Local elites made arrangements. Some traditions continued. Some were translated into Roman forms. Some were forgotten because the documents that might have explained them did not survive. The body of a population can continue while the public name of its civilization fades. This is one of the oldest patterns in human history. Our species has always carried the past forward in uneven ways, preserving useful habits while losing the voices that first shaped them. A child may learn a gesture without knowing who began it. A city may keep a ceremony after its first meaning has thinned. An empire may absorb the knowledge of its neighbours and later describe that knowledge as its own. In early Italy, Rome's rise slowly rearranged memory itself. The Etruscans became ancestors, rivals, teachers, and defeated neighbours inside a story written mostly by others. So the opening map of this video is not a map of replacement alone. It is a map of inheritance. Before Rome could become Rome, Italy had already been worked by many hands. And among those hands, the Etruscans left the deepest marks. The central question remains open. When a young power grows by absorbing an older world, how much of that older world is truly gone? Etruria was not only a name on an ancient map. It was a landscape that taught people how to live with height, water, stone, forest, metal, and sea. The core of this Etruscan world lay in western central Italy, mainly between the Arno River to the north and the Tiber River to the south, facing the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was a place of ridges and plateaus, volcanic hills, deep valleys, fertile pockets of soil, and routes that could lead either inland toward other Italic peoples or outward toward the wider Mediterranean. To understand why the Etruscans became so important before Rome, it helps to begin not with kings or battles, but with the ground beneath their feet. Human societies do not rise in empty space. Since the earliest human communities, people have searched for places where water could be reached, food could be grown or gathered, animals could be managed, danger could be seen from a distance, and movement could be controlled. Etruria offered many of those things at once. Hilltop settlements could watch over valleys and roads, rivers could carry people, goods, and news across the land. The coast opened a passage to sailors, traders, and distant influences. Forests could provide timber, fields could support families. Mineral-rich zones, especially in and around parts of Tuscany and nearby islands such as Elba, gave skilled workers access to valuable raw material. None of these features created civilization by themselves. A river does not build a city. A hill does not make a people powerful. Metal in the earth remains silent until human hands learn how to find it, heat it, shape it, exchange it, and give it meaning. The Etruscans became important because generations of people learned how to connect these advantages into a wider way of life. Their cities often stood on high ground, not far from farmland, trade paths, and natural defences. From such places they could look across the surrounding countryside and organise the movement of grain, animals, tools, pottery, and metalwork. The land encouraged both separation and connection. Valleys and ridges gave each city its own local world, but rivers, roads, and sea routes kept those worlds from becoming isolated. This helps explain why the Etruscan civilization appears as a network of cities rather than a single kingdom ruled from one throne. Each city had its own weight, its own burial grounds, its own leaders, and its own relationship with neighbouring communities. Yet together they shared patterns of language, art, religion, and elite display that made them recognisable as part of one broader culture. The sea was especially important because Etruria did not face only inward. Across the Tyrrhenian waters lay islands, Greek settlements, Phoenician and Carthaginian connections, and long routes of Mediterranean exchange. Ships carried more than goods. They carried styles of pottery, images of gods, habits of feasting, alphabets, ornaments, and ideas about status. The Etruscans did not simply copy what arrived. Like all human groups since our beginning, they absorbed outside knowledge through the needs and habits of their own environment. What came by sea was reshaped by inland cities, local workshops, family lines, and rituals connected to the dead. Their world was therefore both local and wide. A tomb painting could show a style touched by Mediterranean contact, while the tomb itself belonged to a specific hill city and a specific family memory. A metal object could begin with ore from nearby land, pass through trained hands, and end as a gift, a trade item, or a grave offering. In this way, Etruria became a bridge between earth and sea. Rome, still young near the Tiber, stood close to the southern edge of this older zone of influence. The river that helped Rome grow also marked contact with worlds already shaped by Etruscan power. Before Rome could imagine itself as the centre of Italy, Etruria had already shown how a people could turn landscape into wealth, wealth into cities, and cities into a memory strong enough to survive even after its name was pushed into the background. The wealth of Etruscan cities did not come from mystery. It came from a patient meeting of land, skill, and exchange. In the hills and coastal zones of Etruria, people had access to farmland, forests, clay, stone, and mineral resources that could be turned into useful goods. Iron from Elba and other metals from the wider region helped support workshops where raw material became tools, weapons, vessels, ornaments, and offerings. Yet metal alone could not make a civilization powerful. Ore had to be found, mined, transported, heated, shaped, and carried into markets or rituals. Each step required knowledge passed from hand to hand, from older workers to younger ones, across families and cities. This slow transfer of skill is one of the oldest human patterns. Long before written states, human communities survived by remembering where useful materials lay, how fire changed them, and how a shaped object could protect a body, feed a family, or mark belonging. In Etruria, that ancient habit became more complex because the products of labour could move beyond one village or valley. A blade, a bronze vessel, a decorated object, or a piece of jewellery could carry the value of Etruscan work into another community, and in return bring back pottery, wine, oil, amber, ivory, images, or new habits of display. Trade across the Tyrrhenian Sea connected Etruscan cities with Greek settlements, Phoenician and Carthaginian networks, and many smaller routes that crossed the Mediterranean. This did not make Etruria a passive receiver of foreign influence. It made it a place where outside goods were selected, adapted, and given local meaning. A Greek vase in an Etruscan tomb does not mean an Etruscan family became Greek. It means that objects could travel farther than the lives of the people who owned them, and that status could be shown through things that carried distant connections. Wealth gathered most strongly where geography allowed many streams of value to meet. Hill cities could oversee nearby fields and roads. Coastal access opened contact with sailors. Rivers and land routes tied inland. Settlements to ports. Forests supplied fuel and building material. Mines and workshops supplied goods that others wanted. Over time, this created a social world in which leading families could display rank through houses, tombs, feasts, imported objects, inscriptions, and ritual objects. The evidence is strongest in cemeteries and elite settings, so we must be careful not to imagine every Etruscan life as luxurious. Many people would have laboured in fields, workshops, households, ships, and mines. often leaving fewer personal traces for archaeology to recover. Still, the visible remains show that some cities became wealthy enough to build, commission, trade, and remember themselves in lasting material forms. This kind of wealth also shaped politics. A city that controlled routes, resources, and skilled production could bargain with neighbours, support warriors, sponsor ceremonies, and attract people from the countryside. But because Etruscan strength was spread across many cities, prosperity did not automatically become one unified empire. It formed a chain of local powers, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. That pattern was rooted in the land itself. Ridges, valleys, harbours, and river corridors encouraged separate centres to grow while keeping them connected enough to share a wider culture. In human history, wealth often begins as stored energy. Grain kept after harvest, metal shaped after mining, a road kept safe, a harbour kept open, a craft remembered accurately. The Etruscans turned stored energy into visible civilization. Rome later rose close to this older world and learned in its shadow. When Roman power expanded, it did not step into a poor or silent Italy. It moved into a region where Etruscan cities had already shown how resources, trade, and skilled hands could make power durable enough to be inherited, copied, and finally renamed. The Etruscan rise is easiest to misunderstand if we search for one throne, one capital, or one ruler commanding the whole of Italy before Rome. Their strength worked in a different way. It was spread across cities, each rooted in its own hill, valley, road, cemetery, harbour connection, and farmland. Places such as Tarquinia, Veii, Cerveteri, Vulci, Volterra, Chiusi, and others were not dots under a single flag. They were living centres with families, workshops, sacred spaces, alliances, rivalries, and memories. Together, they formed a civilization recognisable by shared language, religious practices, artistic habits, burial customs, and patterns of status. But recognition is not the same as obedience. The Etruscan world could be culturally connected while remaining politically divided. That difference is important because Rome would grow by solving, in its own hard way, a problem that the Etruscan cities never fully overcame: how to turn many local strengths into one expanding system. In the beginning of all human settlement, survival often depended on small groups learning one landscape well. People knew which ridge gave shelter, which stream held water in dry months, which path led through trees, and which neighbouring group could be traded with, feared, or joined by marriage. As communities became larger, that old local knowledge did not disappear. It became the foundation of towns and cities. Etruria preserved much of that pattern. Each city looked outward, but each also remained tied to its own ground. This gave the Etruscans resilience. If one city weakened, others could still prosper. If one trading route changed, another harbour or road might remain useful. A network can bend where a single rigid centre might break, yet the same pattern carried a quiet weakness. When pressure came from organised rivals, separate cities could choose separate answers. One might fight, another might negotiate, another might wait, another might protect its own fields before helping a neighbour. The evidence does not allow us to turn this into a simple moral lesson, as if unity is wisdom and local freedom is failure. History is rarely that clean. For a long time, the city network helped Etruscan culture spread widely without needing a single empire. Their influence reached Rome, Campania, the Po Valley, and maritime contacts. Their goods, symbols, and customs could move even when no central government forced them to move. This is why their world feels strong and fragile at the same time. It had breadth, wealth, and prestige, but not the later Roman habit of absorbing communities into a growing political machine. Rome, in its early centuries, learned beside this older landscape. It saw city power, ritual authority, engineering knowledge, and elite display in forms already present around it. But Rome gradually became something different. A community able to bind conquered peoples, extend citizenship in stages, build military obligations, and turn defeat into incorporation. The Etruscans had shaped a world of powerful neighbours. Rome learned how to make neighbours into Romans. From the deeper view of human beginnings, this is a shift in how memory and belonging are organised. Early human groups survived by holding identity close, around kin, place, and repeated custom. Larger states survive by stretching identity beyond its first home. The Etruscan cities remained attached to their local names and sacred landscapes, while Rome slowly widened the meaning of membership. That difference did not erase the Etruscans at once. It placed them in a slower danger. A city can keep walls, families, and rituals, while the larger story around it changes language. A people can be influential before conquest and still be remembered mainly through the record of the power that absorbed them. So the rise of Etruria was not the rise of one empire waiting to fall. It was the rise of a shared civilization carried by many cities, strong enough to shape Italy before Rome, yet divided enough that Rome could inherit its world piece by piece. To understand Etruscan power, it is better to imagine a chain of cities than a kingdom with one heart. Each city had its own walls, sanctuaries, leading families, burial grounds, workshops, fields, and routes of contact. Tarquinia looked across its countryside and toward the sea. Veii stood close enough to early Rome to become both neighbour and rival. Cerveteri, Vulci, Volterra, Cusi, and other centres carried their own local weight. They were linked by language, ritual habits, art, trade, and aristocratic culture, but they were not simply branches of one central government. Their civilization was shared, while their political life remained divided. This distinction helps us avoid a false picture. When people hear that a civilization ruled Italy before Rome, they may imagine a map coloured by one Etruscan state. The evidence points to something more human and more uneven, a world where power gathered in many places, each one deeply attached to its land. That pattern reaches back to the oldest roots of settlement. Early human groups did not first know nations. They knew water sources, hills, paths, hunting grounds, fields, kin ties, and neighbouring groups. As settlements grew larger, those local attachments became the emotional and practical foundation of cities. In Etruria, a city was not only a place of houses, it was a centre of memory. Its dead lay nearby in tombs that could resemble houses for another existence. Its leaders displayed status through objects, feasts, rituals, and public works. Its artisans shaped clay, bronze, iron, and gold into things that carried both usefulness and meaning. Its farmers made the surrounding land productive. Its merchants and sailors connected the city to a wider sea. No single ruler needed to command all Etruscan people for this culture to feel broad and powerful. Similar forms could spread because elites saw one another, traded with one another, competed with one another, and shared religious and social habits across distance. Ancient writers described assemblies or common religious meetings among Etruscan cities, and there is reason to think that shared gatherings helped sustain identity. But the exact workings of Etruscan political cooperation remain difficult to reconstruct, because their own long explanations have not survived in the way Roman historical writing did. A careful account must therefore stay close to what can be supported. City centres existed, they shared a recognisable culture, and they did not form a unified empire like Rome later became. This city-based structure gave Etruria energy. Several centres could become wealthy at the same time. If one city had a stronger harbour, another might have stronger inland routes. If one family line became prominent in one place, another could rise somewhere else. Competition could push building, display, craft production and exchange forward, yet the same structure also made common action difficult. When Rome was still small, local rivalry may have seemed natural, even useful. In the deep human past, groups often survived by protecting the immediate circle first. The home ground, the kin group, the familiar paths. That instinct does not disappear just because cities grow rich. It can remain inside political choices. A city may understand a wider cultural kinship and still hesitate to sacrifice itself for a neighbour. Rome would eventually take advantage of this older pattern. It did not defeat a single Etruscan empire in one clean stroke. It faced cities, alliances, rivalries, treaties, wars, and absorption. One Etruscan centre could fall while another continued. One could negotiate while another resisted. This slow unevenness is part of why the disappearance of Etruscan independence can look less dramatic than the title suggests. Their world did not vanish because it was weak in culture. It faded as political names, laws, military obligations and public memory shifted toward Rome. Before that shift was complete, Etruria stood as a civilization of cities, many centres, one cultural field, and no single voice strong enough to hold the whole story together forever. The city-based structure of Etruscan civilization gave it a special kind of strength. A single capital can command quickly, but it can also fail quickly when its centre is broken. A network of cities spreads weight across many places. If one city loses trade, another may still grow. If one road becomes unsafe, another route may remain open. If one ruling family weakens, another family in another city can continue the same wider culture without waiting for permission from a distant throne. In Etruria, this meant that power could live in several landscapes at once. Coastal cities could look toward ships and harbours. Inland cities could look toward fields, hills, mines and roads. Each community held its own memory close, while still belonging to a larger Etruscan world. This pattern fits a very old human habit. From the beginning, human groups survived by knowing the nearby ground with great care. They learned where water stayed, where animals moved, where danger approached and where the dead should be remembered. Even when cities grew large and wealthy, that attachment to local ground remained strong. The Etruscan city was not just an administrative unit. It was a home for ancestors, families, gods, markets, workshops, graves, and repeated ceremonies that made local identity deep and durable. It also made unity harder. A city that felt complete in itself did not always need to obey another city. It could share language and ritual, yet still protect its own interests first. This is the quiet weakness inside the Etruscan achievement. Their cities could cooperate, trade, imitate, and meet through shared customs. But when danger grew, their choices did not always become one choice. A flexible network can adjust to change, but it may struggle against a rival that learns how to gather many communities under one expanding system. Rome would later become that kind of rival. Early Rome was not born stronger than every Etruscan city. It stood near older powers and learned inside their shadow. Over time, however, Rome developed a different political habit. It could fight, make treaties, demand service, extend forms of belonging, and turn former enemies into useful members of a larger structure. The Etruscan cities, by contrast, remained more closely tied to their individual names and territories. This difference did not make them primitive or confused. It only meant that their strength belonged to another kind of world, one where prestige, wealth, and sacred authority could be shared culturally without being fused into one military machine. Across human history, the passage from local belonging to wider political identity has often been slow and uneven. People may accept the goods of a wider world before they accept its command. They may copy a style, use a script, attend a shared ritual, or marry across communities, while still thinking first of their own city. The Etruscans show this older balance clearly. Their world could spread influence without becoming an empire in the Roman sense. It could leave marks on Rome before Rome had the power to absorb it. It could teach the future conqueror without controlling what that conqueror would become. This is why their later fading cannot be explained by one battle or one failure. Their political form had worked well in a peninsula of many powers, where cities watched one another and adjusted to changing trade and alliances. But as Rome grew more organized, the same form became more exposed. Separate cities faced pressure at different times. Some resisted, some negotiated, some were drawn gradually into Roman orbit. Their cultural life did not end at the first moment of defeat, but the public story of who ruled Italy began to shift. Local flexibility had helped the Etruscans rise before Rome. Local division helped Rome absorb them after its own system became stronger. In that movement, the older human attachment to place met a new Roman ability to stretch power beyond place. And the civilization that once shaped Italy began to survive mostly inside another name. Rome's early growth makes more sense when it is seen beside the city world that came before it. The Etruscan cities showed what power could look like in central Italy. High settlements overlooking roads and fields, sacred places tied to local memory, workshops turning metal and clay into objects of value, and leading families using ritual and display to mark authority. Rome did not rise in ignorance of these forms. It grew near them, touched them, and later reshaped many of them into something more centralized. The difference was not that Rome had culture while Etruria had only mystery. The difference was that Rome gradually learned how to make political belonging expand beyond the first circle of city and kin. At the beginning of human life in settled places, identity was usually close to the ground. A group knew its water, its dead, its fields, its paths, and its neighbours. The Etruscan cities kept much of that deep local attachment. Rome also began with local attachment, but over time it developed a harder and wider method. It could take defeat, pressure, alliance, and law, then turn them into a growing structure. A conquered neighbour did not always remain only an enemy. In many cases it could be bound by treaty, obligation, service, road, colony, or limited forms of citizenship. This made Roman power different from the older city network. Rome did not merely stand as one city among others forever. It slowly became a machine for joining other communities to its future. That machine was not gentle in the modern sense. It used war, punishment, hierarchy, and demand. But it also offered a path by which many defeated or allied groups could continue living while being drawn into Roman order. This is where the Etruscan story begins to move toward erasure without sudden disappearance. Their cities had influenced Roman symbols of command, religious practice, public ceremony, and urban habits. Ancient Roman tradition remembered Etruscan kings and Etruscan ritual knowledge, though those memories are mixed with legend and later explanation. A careful view cannot separate every historical fact from every inherited story with perfect certainty. Still, it is clear that Rome's early world was close to Etruscan power and that Roman identity formed in contact with it. From the long view of human origins, this is a familiar pattern. Human groups do not only defeat one another, they learn, absorb, rename, and reorganize. A tool made for one community can be used by another. A ceremony can survive after its first language fades. A road can keep carrying feet after the political name of the land has changed. Rome's genius, if we use that word carefully, was not pure invention. It was the ability to gather older materials into a larger system that could continue expanding. The Etruscan cities had helped shape the world Rome inherited, but their divided political life made it difficult to resist a neighbour that was becoming more coordinated across time. Veii's long conflict with Rome, for example, shows how close and serious that rivalry could be, yet the fall of one city did not mean the instant fall of all Etruria. Instead, Roman pressure advanced across generations, city by city, treaty by treaty, war by war. This slow movement matters because it keeps the story honest. The Etruscans were not erased because they had no achievements. They were partly erased because their achievements became useful to a power that could tell history more loudly afterward. Rome learned from a world of city-states, but Rome turned learning into incorporation. The older Etruscan map remained under the Roman map, like an earlier layer of paint showing through where time has worn the surface thin. Before Rome could claim Italy, it had first grown beside those who had already taught Italy how cities, symbols, and sacred authority could be made to last. To listen for the Etruscans, we have to place our ear close to the ground, because their longest surviving voice is not a book of history, but the material world they left behind. Rome left speeches, laws, poems, military accounts, legends, and political memories in Latin. Greece left many written traditions that later readers could enter with relative ease. The Etruscans also used writing, and their language can be read in many inscriptions, but most surviving texts are short, often tied to names, ownership, offerings, tombs, or ritual use. Few long explanations remain to tell us how they describe their own rise, their own cities, or their own place in Italy. So, the path toward them is different. It moves through tomb chambers, painted walls, carved sarcophagi, bronze mirrors, temple foundations, roof tiles, pottery, tools, ornaments, city walls, roads, and the position of settlements on the land. This is not a weaker kind of evidence. It is simply a quieter one. Human beings have always left more behind than words. Long before written history, our species marked life through hearths, bones, stones, pigments, paths, graves, and repeated actions in familiar places. Archaeology listens to those traces because they show what bodies did, where hands worked, where families gathered, where the dead were placed, and where memory was made solid. For the Etruscans, this kind of listening is essential. Their tombs, especially in places such as Tarquinia and Cerveteri, preserve a world that Roman writing alone could never fully show. Painted scenes of banquets, dancers, musicians, animals, games and processions suggest a society that invested great care in the relationship between the living and the dead. Large cemeteries laid out like cities of stone and earth show that burial was not a small private act, but a major form of social memory. Objects placed with the dead reveal wealth, trade connections, craft skill, family identity, and contact with the wider Mediterranean. Yet these remains must be approached with patience. A tomb is not a complete portrait of daily life. It often shows what families wanted remembered, not everything that people experienced. The rich are more visible than the poor. Ceremonies leave stronger traces than ordinary labour. Imported goods may reveal contact but not always belief. A painted feast may show status and ritual, but it cannot tell us every thought in the mind of the people who commissioned it. From the beginning of human life, the things that survive are uneven. A stone tool may outlast a song. A wall may outlast a conversation. A grave may preserve ornaments while the voice of the person buried there is gone. The Etruscan past reaches us through that uneven survival. This is why careful history must avoid turning silence into fantasy. It is tempting to call the Etruscans mysterious and then fill the empty space with certainty, but that would make the story less true. The better approach is slower. We can say that they built strong cities before Rome became dominant. We can say that their material culture shows wealth, skill, religious seriousness, and deep connections across Italy and the Mediterranean. We can say that Roman power later absorbed many Etruscan communities, and that Roman memory shaped how later generations viewed them. But where the evidence stops, the script must also slow down. Their erasure was not caused by the absence of remains. In many places the remains are abundant. The erasure came because objects survived more strongly than explanations, and because the later Roman story became the louder frame around them. Archaeology, therefore, does more than recover lost things. It returns weight to a civilization whose own long narrative is mostly missing. Each wall, tomb, inscription, and crafted object reminds us that before Rome renamed the centre of Italy, another people had already made the land speak through stone, metal, colour, and the careful keeping of the dead. When the Etruscans speak through archaeology, they often speak from places built for the dead, yet those places are full of life. In the painted tombs of Tarquinia, human figures recline at banquets, musicians lift their instruments, dancers move with controlled rhythm, servants carry vessels, animals appear near borders and thresholds, and colour still clings to walls that were closed away for centuries. In the great cemeteries near Cerveteri, tombs can resemble houses, with rooms, doorways, carved beams, stone beds, and spaces arranged as if the family world had been carried underground. These are not small accidental remains. They show planning, wealth, craft, ritual attention, and a desire to make memory durable. A grave could become more than a place of burial. It could become a second dwelling, a statement of family identity, and a visible sign that the living still belong to those who came before them. This habit is deeply human. Since the earliest beginnings of our species, people have tried to hold the dead close through objects, marks, places, and repeated gestures. Long before cities, a burial could turn grief into order and make one life part of a shared ground. In Etruria, that old human need became monumental, painted, carved, and filled with objects that still allow us to see the outline of a society Rome later overshadowed. The objects placed in tombs widen that outline. Pottery vessels, bronze mirrors, weapons, jewellery, lamps, figurines, imported goods, carved stone, and decorated sarcophagi show a world of skilled hands and careful choices. Some objects were made locally, others came through trade or were shaped under the influence of Greek and Mediterranean styles, but when they entered Etruscan settings, they did not remain foreign in a simple way. They became part of Etruscan display, Etruscan family memory, and Etruscan ritual practice. A painted Greek-style vase placed inside an Etruscan tomb tells us about contact across the sea, but it also tells us about how an Etruscan household wished to present itself. A bronze mirror may show fine metalwork and images drawn from shared Mediterranean stories, yet it also belongs to a specific social world of grooming. status, gender, and offering. A sarcophagus showing a reclining couple does not give us a diary of their marriage, but it does show that certain families chose to remember the dead, with faces, gestures, and bodily presence rather than only with names. These traces make the Etruscans feel close because they are not abstract. They show chairs, cups, hands, clothing, animals, food, music, movement, and rooms. They remind us that before Rome became the dominant name, Italy already contained people who arranged beauty around death, worked materials with confidence, and connected private memory to public status. At the same time, the evidence asks for restraint. Tomb art often reflects elite families more than ordinary labourers. Fine objects survive better than baskets, wool, food, and voices. Ceremonial scenes may show ideals, not everyday reality. Still, the pattern is strong enough to matter. The Etruscans were not a vague shadow before Rome. They left cities of the dead that mirror cities of the living. They left painted walls that suggest music and gathering. They left metalwork that shows technical skill. They left pottery and ornaments that show trade, taste, and social meaning. Rome would later absorb their lands and reshape their public memory, but it could not erase the fact that, beneath the Roman story, another civilization had already learned how to make stone, colour, clay, and bronze carry human presence across time. The surviving beauty of Etruscan archaeology can make the past feel almost close enough to enter, but it also creates a quiet danger. What remains most clearly is not always what was most common. Painted tombs, carved sarcophagi, bronze mirrors, imported pottery, fine jewellery, and carefully built burial chambers speak with great force, yet they often speak for families with wealth, status, and the ability to command skilled labour. The ordinary worker in a field, the person hauling timber, the miner breathing dust, the servant preparing a feast, the child who left no inscription, and the household that owned few lasting objects are harder to see. Their lives supported the world that archaeology reveals, but their traces are thinner. This is not unique to Etruria. From the earliest human beginnings, the record of life has always been uneven. Stone can remain when skin is gone. Metal can survive when wood has rotted. A grave can preserve a necklace while the voice that once explained its meaning disappears. History often reaches us through the strongest materials, not through the largest number of lives. So when we look at Etruscan tombs, we are not seeing the whole civilization in equal light. We are seeing places where memory was deliberately made durable. That durability is precious, but it is also selective. A painted banquet may tell us that elite families valued display, music, food, gesture, and social rank in funerary settings. It does not prove that every Etruscan household lived with such ease. A weapon in a grave may suggest status, ritual, or identity, but it does not let us reconstruct every battle or every man's daily role. A woman shown with dignity beside a man may reveal something important about how certain families represented gender and family status. Yet it should not be turned too quickly into a complete account of all women's lives. The evidence invites us forward, but it also asks us to stop before certainty becomes invention. This restraint is especially important because the Etruscans have often been surrounded by a language of mystery. Mystery can be useful when it means humility. It becomes harmful when it becomes permission to imagine anything. A civilization does not need exaggerated secrets to be worth understanding. The real Etruscans are already remarkable because they shaped cities before Rome, joined Mediterranean exchange, developed rich burial traditions, used writing, worked metal with skill, and influenced the world that later absorbed them. These facts are strong enough. They do not need decoration. What we can responsibly say comes from patterns repeated across sites and objects. There were wealthy urban communities. There were organized burial customs. There were artisans, traders, farmers, religious specialists, families, and political elites. There were contacts with Greeks, Phoenicians, and other Italic peoples. There was a language written in an alphabet adapted from Greek models, and there was a later process in which Roman power drew Etruscan cities into its own system. What we cannot do is pretend to hear every private thought, every belief, every fear, or every spoken explanation behind the objects. In the deep history of humanity, material traces are like footprints near a shoreline. They show that people passed through, how they moved, sometimes what they carried, but not every word they spoke while walking. The Etruscans left many footprints, some vivid and beautiful, some broken and difficult. Rome later walked over the same ground, with heavier writing and a larger political memory. That is why the Etruscan past feels both rich and incomplete. The remains are not silent, but they are not unlimited. Care, here, is not hesitation. It is how evidence keeps its human weight across time without forced certainty. If we listen carefully, they tell us that before Rome's story became dominant, another civilization had built a complex world in Italy. If we listen too loudly, we risk replacing that world with our own imagination. The cemeteries of the Etruscans can feel, at first, like quiet settlements placed beside the living world. In places such as Cerveteri, tombs were arranged along paths shaped with doorways, chambers, stone beds, carved roof beams, and rooms that echo the houses of the living. At Tarquinia, painted chambers open into scenes of movement, colour, music, animals, banquets, and ritual gestures. These burial landscapes were not hidden scraps at the edge of history. They were carefully made places where families, memory, status, and the dead remained close to the city. A modern visitor may walk among rounded tomb mounds and rock-cut rooms and feel that the ground itself has been turned into an older neighbourhood, one without ordinary voices but not without human presence. This matters for the story before Rome because it shows a civilization that did not leave only weapons or broken walls. It left a map of remembrance. The Etruscans built for the dead with a seriousness that tells us how strongly families and communities wish to continue a bond across time. We should not claim to know exactly what every painted scene meant to them, or what every person believed happened after death. The evidence does not allow that kind of certainty, but the effort is visible. The dead were not simply removed. They were placed within structured spaces, surrounded by objects, images, and forms that carried identity beyond the last breath. Since the earliest human communities, burial has been one of the ways people turned loss into order. Long before cities, human groups marked death with attention, sometimes with objects, sometimes with repeated places, sometimes with the careful position of a body. Such acts do not prove a single belief, but they show that the dead mattered to the living. In Etruria, that old human impulse became architectural. Tombs could resemble houses because memory itself needed a dwelling. A chamber could hold a body, but also a family name, a social position, a link to ancestors, and a message to later generations. The cemetery became a second city because the living city could not fully explain itself without those who had come before. This is one reason Etruscan remains feel so different from the later Roman story that covered them. Rome would become famous for law, conquest, roads, and public power. Etruscan cemeteries speak more softly, through the continuity between household and grave, between family and landscape, between social life and the underworld of memory. The tombs near Cerveteri especially show how burial could mirror domestic space. Stone pillows, benches, doorways, and carved household forms suggest that death was represented through familiar shapes, not through emptiness alone. At Tarquinia, painted walls show banquets and music, but care is needed here. A painted banquet is not a photograph of ordinary life, and not a full explanation of belief. It is a chosen image, probably shaped by family rank, ritual expectation, and artistic tradition. Still, the choice itself is meaningful. These people did not remember the dead only with silence. They remembered them with rooms, colour, posture, and objects that made the human body part of a continuing scene. In deep human history, one of the oldest fears is not only death, but disappearance from the minds of others. A grave answers that fear imperfectly. It says that someone stood here, belonged here, and should not be lost at once. The Etruscans gave that answer in stone and paint before Rome became the keeper of Italy's larger memory. Later, when Roman power absorbed Etruscan cities, many names, languages, and explanations faded. Yet the silent cities under the ground remained, holding a different kind of testimony. They remind us that the civilization before Rome was not erased because it left nothing behind. It was partly erased because what remained most strongly was memory without a full surviving voice. Inside many Etruscan tombs, death is not shown only as separation. It is surrounded by images of gathering. Painted walls at Tarquinia show banquets where figures recline, musicians play, dancers move, servants approach with vessels, and animals appear near the edges of the scene. These images should not be read as simple pictures of ordinary evenings. They were chosen for burial spaces shaped by ritual, wealth, family memory, and artistic convention. Still, their calm force is important. The dead were placed near scenes of human company, not only near symbols of absence. A cup, a couch, a musical gesture, a shared meal, or the presence of relatives could turn the tomb into a remembered social world. In that world, death did not erase the person at once from the visible order of family and status. It moved the person into another kind of arranged space, where memory continued through images, objects, and names. Since the earliest human communities, people have tried to soften the break of death by giving it form. A body placed carefully in the ground, an object left nearby, a repeated visit to a burial place, or a mark made on stone, all suggest the same old human need to prevent a life from falling immediately into nothing. The Etruscans developed that need with unusual richness. Their tombs could resemble houses, and their paintings could fill those houses of the dead with movement. In some sarcophagi and funerary sculptures, men and women are shown reclining, as if at a meal, their bodies still given presence and dignity. Such images do not allow us to know every belief they held about an afterlife, but they do show that family identity and public remembrance matter deeply. A person's name, lineage, posture, clothing, and place among others could remain meaningful after death. This is one reason Etruscan cemeteries are so valuable for understanding Italy before Rome. They reveal a civilization where memory was not only written but built and painted. They show that social life could continue symbolically underground, while the living city carried on above. The banquet scenes also point toward a society connected to the wider Mediterranean. Reclining at feasts, decorated vessels, music, and images of celebration were all themes that moved through ancient cultures in different forms. But in Etruscan tombs, they were adapted to local families, local burial customs, and local ideas of honour. We should not flatten them into Greek copies or Roman preludes. They belong to Etruscan choices, even when shaped by outside contact. This balance between borrowing and belonging is one of the oldest patterns in human history. Human groups have always received gestures, tools, symbols, and stories from neighbours, then remade them inside their own homes and graves. In Etruria, a shared meal painted for the dead could carry both Mediterranean style and local memory. The result is not a full explanation, but a strong trace of continuity. The dead were held within scenes that suggested company, music, household identity, and ritual order. Later, Rome would inherit pieces of Etruscan religious authority and social symbolism, while also placing Etruscan history under a Roman frame. Yet these tombs resist complete erasure. They do not speak loudly in political language. They speak through bodies at rest, hands near cups, musicians in motion, and families trying to make absence bearable. In a quiet way, they remind us that before Rome claimed the story of Italy, another civilization had already asked how human life could remain present after the breath had gone. The deepest mistake we can make with Etruscan tombs is to treat their images as if they were direct translations of private belief. A painted banquet, a carved couple, a chamber shaped like a house, or a vessel placed beside the dead can show us choices, patterns, wealth, and memory. They cannot give us a complete map of the inner life of every person who lived in Etruria. Care is needed because the remains are powerful. Their beauty invites interpretation, and interpretation can easily move faster than evidence. We can say that Etruscan families invested great labour in burial. We can say that many tombs created a space where the dead were remembered through household forms, food, music, names, objects, and images of social presence. We can say that death was treated as something requiring order, attention, and continued connection. But we should not say too confidently what every Etruscan person thought the dead experienced, or what each painted figure meant in the minds of those who commissioned it. The evidence allows a respectful nearness, not possession. This is not a weakness in the story, it is part of what makes the story honest. From the earliest human beginnings, the dead have often been among the strongest signs of how living communities understood themselves. A grave can show care without explaining doctrine, An object beside a body can show attachment without naming a full theology. A place revisited by descendants can show memory without giving us the words spoken there. The Etruscans stand within that long human pattern, but their version became especially visible because stone, paint, metal, and ceramic endured, where breath, song, and daily conversation disappeared. Their tombs help us understand not because they answer every question, but because they reveal what a society chose to preserve when facing loss. This careful reading also protects the Etruscans from being turned into an ornament of mystery. When a civilization leaves fewer long texts than its conquerors, later generations often surround it with exaggerated strangeness. The Etruscans do not need that treatment. They were human communities with cities, families, leaders, artisans, farmers, traders, religious specialists, and neighbours. Their burial art may feel unusual beside later Roman habits, but unusual does not mean unknowable, and unknowable does not mean we may invent. What we have is enough to see seriousness, status, beauty, and continuity. It is not enough to assign one simple belief to all of Etruria across all places and generations. The tombs of a wealthy family in Tarquinia cannot speak for every shepherd, potter, miner, child, or servant. The objects in a chamber may show an ideal image of life, not the full texture of life as it was actually lived. In the deep record of our species, the past is always uneven in this way. The durable things often belong to those who had the means to make durability. Yet even this unevenness tells us something important about erasure. Rome did not erase the Etruscans by making every trace vanish. Many traces survived in extraordinary form. What faded was the continuous Etruscan explanation of those traces, the living language around them, and the public power that once gave them context. When Rome became the larger storyteller, Etruscan tombs remained like rooms after the voices had gone quiet. We can still see the couches, the painted dancers, the vessels, the carved faces, and the care. We can still sense that death was not treated as a blank disappearance. But the safest truth is also the most moving one. We are looking at memory made by people whose full words have not reached us. Their civilization before Rome remains present in the ground, but it asks to be approached slowly, with humility, because not every silence should be filled. One of the clearest differences between Etruscan material culture and many later Greek and Roman descriptions of respectable public life is the visibility of women. In Etruscan tomb paintings, sarcophagi, inscriptions, and funerary settings, women do not appear only as distant shadows behind men. They are shown reclining at banquets, seated beside husbands, named in family contexts, honoured in burial spaces, and remembered with faces, gestures, clothing, and sometimes personal identity. This does not mean that Etruscan society was equal in any modern sense. It does not prove that every woman held power, freedom, or comfort. The evidence is mostly strongest among families wealthy enough to leave durable monuments, but the visibility itself matters. It suggests that in at least some Etruscan social settings, elite women could be represented as active members of family memory and public display, not only as hidden figures inside the household. A reclining couple on a funerary monument, for example, should not be read as a private photograph of marriage, but it does show a chosen image of togetherness. A woman's name in an inscription does not tell us her whole life, but it allows her to stand in the record as more than an unnamed relation. These traces bring the Etruscans closer, because they remind us that civilizations are not only made by armies, rulers, and walls. They are also made by bodies around meals, names preserved by descendants, clothing chosen for display, gestures carved into stone, and family lines remembered after death. From the earliest human beginnings, survival depended not only on individual strength, but on social bonds. Mothers and fathers, children and elders, kin groups, shared food, and the long teaching of skills across generations. No city could rise without the hidden labour of households. No culture could continue without birth, care, learning, inheritance, and the keeping of names. In Etruscan archaeology, some of that family world becomes visible in ways that later Roman moral writing sometimes found uncomfortable or strange. Women appear in banqueting scenes where Greek and Roman observers may have expected respectable women to be less publicly present. They appear in tombs where the family wished to show rank and continuity. They appear in inscriptions that can preserve both personal names and family connections, helping scholars trace relationships across generations. Again, caution is needed. A tomb image is a formal image. It may show ideal status rather than everyday behavior. It may belong to a narrow social class. It may reflect ritual expectations more than ordinary life. Still, the repeated presence of women in these settings is not accidental. It tells us that Etruscan identity was carried through family memory, with a degree of female visibility that distinguished it from the way hostile or moralizing outsiders later described them. This matters for the larger story of Rome and Eurasia. When Rome absorbed Etruscan cities, it did not only absorb land and rituals, it also absorbed a society whose family forms, elite habits, and public images did not fit neatly into later Roman self-presentation. Roman writers sometimes treated Etruscan customs as excessive, luxurious, or morally suspect, especially when speaking about women. Such judgments reveal as much about Roman anxieties as about Etruscan life. The material evidence asks us to look more gently. It shows women remembered beside men, not as a scandal, but as a repeated social image. It shows family as one of the places where civilization survived beyond conquest. Long after political independence faded, names on stone and figures in tombs continued to say that Etruscan life had once organized memory through households where women could be seen. Before Rome's version of Italy became dominant, another civilization had already carved family presence into the ground, and some of its most human traces are the women who were not allowed to disappear completely. When Greek and Roman writers described the Etruscans, they were not looking from a neutral place outside history. They were looking from their own societies, with their own rules about gender, respectability, luxury, public behavior, and political order. This matters because many later ideas about the Etruscans passed through those outside voices. A Roman author might describe an Etruscan custom not only to explain Etruria, but also to warn Roman readers about what seemed excessive, foreign, old-fashioned, or morally dangerous. A Greek observer might see women at banquets or visible in public family display, and interpret that visibility through Greek assumptions about what respectable women should or should not do. The result is not useless evidence, but evidence with a lens in front of it. We can read it, but we should not forget the lens. The material record gives us a quieter balance. Tomb paintings, funerary monuments, and inscriptions show that elite Etruscan women could be represented beside men, named in family memory, and included in scenes of social presence. Outside writers sometimes turn such visibility into accusation, as if difference itself needed correction. Yet difference is not the same as disorder. From the earliest human communities, every group has made rules around family, food, pairing, inheritance, public behavior, and the bodies of men and women. These rules are never only biological. They are shaped by memory, land, labor, property, fear, status, and the need to teach children how to belong. In Etruria, some of those rules seem to have allowed women of certain families to appear more visibly in elite representation than was comfortable for many Greek and Roman commentators. That does not mean all Etruscan women lived freely, or that Etruria should be imagined as a modern society hidden in the ancient world. It means that the evidence does not match a simple Roman moral judgment. The women we see most clearly are often women of high status, preserved by families with enough wealth to commission stone, paint, and inscriptions. Their visibility tells us something real, but not everything. It tells us that family identity could be displayed through both male and female presence. It tells us that names and relationships mattered. It tells us that Roman descriptions of Etruscan behavior may reflect Roman discomfort as much as Etruscan reality. This is a gentle but important point for the larger story of Eurasia. A conquered civilization can be diminished not only by losing territory, but by being described through the vocabulary of those who defeated or absorbed it. If Rome later became the main storyteller, then Etruscan customs could be remembered as strange, loose, luxurious, or improper, instead of being understood first as local ways of organizing family and status. Across deep human history, groups have often defined themselves by describing neighbors as unlike themselves. That habit is older than writing. A band, village, city, or state strengthens its own identity by saying what it is not. Rome did this too. It inherited much from Etruscan culture, but it also needed stories that made Roman discipline, Roman ancestry, and Roman public virtue feel distinct. So Etruscan women, visible in tombs and family images, could become part of a contrast. The archaeological record asks us to slow that contrast down. It shows not a scandal, but a society with different patterns of representation. It shows households using both male and female figures to carry memory forward. It shows the limits of outsider judgment. Before Rome's language covered much of Italy, the Etruscans had already made family, gender, rank, and remembrance visible in their own forms. To see them honestly, we have to separate the people from the suspicion of those who wrote about them later. It is easy to turn the Etruscans into a strange people standing outside ordinary history, because their own long explanations have mostly not survived. But the more careful view is also the more human one. They were not a riddle placed before Rome for later people to solve like a puzzle. They were a society of cities, families, workers, traders, ritual specialists, farmers, sailors, artisans, children, elders, and political leaders, living in a landscape that gave them both opportunity and pressure. Their customs could differ from Greek or Roman expectations, especially in the visible role of women in elite memory, but difference should not be treated as darkness. It should be treated as evidence that ancient Italy held more than one way of organizing life. A civilization can seem mysterious when its libraries are gone, when its language survives mostly in short inscriptions, and when its conquerors become the main authors of memory. That silence, however, does not make the people unreal. It only means that we must lean more on tombs, objects, city plans, names, and patterns of contact, while refusing to fill every gap with easy certainty. Since the earliest human communities, people have always built social rules from the same basic materials: birth, death, food, fear, kinship, labor, territory, exchange, and memory. Every group answers those needs differently. The Etruscans answered them through city identity, family display, religious practice, craft skill, burial architecture, and Mediterranean exchange. When we see women named and represented in tombs, we should not force that evidence into either a modern dream of equality or an ancient accusation of disorder. We should see it as one trace of how certain Etruscan families wanted status and continuity to be remembered. When we see banquet scenes, we should not decide too quickly that we know what every meal meant. We should notice that social presence, music, gesture, and family rank were chosen as images strong enough to accompany the dead. When we see imported goods, we should not call them imitation alone. We should ask how a local society turned outside objects into local meaning. This slower method protects the Etruscans from two forms of erasure. The first is Roman erasure, where an older civilization becomes only a source, a rival, or a strange prelude to Rome. The second is modern erasure, where real uncertainty becomes dramatic mystery. Both take the Etruscans away from themselves. A truthful account lets them remain complex without pretending to know everything. It recognizes that their society had hierarchy, wealth, labor, gender roles, religious authority, and political division. It also recognizes that these things were arranged in ways that were not identical to the Roman world that later absorbed them. Across deep human time, cultures have disappeared from public memory not only because people died, but because the categories used to describe them changed. A name can fade while descendants remain. A language can shrink while habits continue. A ritual can be borrowed, renamed, and fitted into another state. The Etruscans entered Roman history in just such uneven ways. Some of their influence survived inside Roman authority, while much of their own explanation disappeared. That is why the story must stay calm and precise. We do not need to make them supernatural, lost, or unknowable. Their reality is stronger than that. They show us that before Rome, Italy was already a place of structured societies with their own rules of family, status, memory, and power. The old human need for belonging was present there, as it is wherever people make homes and bury the dead. To restore them even partially is not to invent a vanished wonder. It is to let an older human world stand again on its own ground, with its limits, its evidence, and its silence. Rome's debt to the Etruscan world cannot be measured by one object or one story. It appears as a pattern of influence, spread through buildings, ceremonies, symbols, and ways of imagining authority. Early Rome stood near Etruscan power, traded with it, fought it, and, according to Roman tradition, was even ruled for a time by kings connected with Etruscan names. The details of those early traditions are difficult because legend and history are woven together, but the larger contact is not doubtful. Rome grew in a world where Etruscan cities had already learned how to build on high ground, drain wet places, mark sacred space, shape public ritual, and make power visible to the eye. Some of the most famous signs of Roman authority may have roots or strong parallels in Etruscan practice. The purple-edged robe, the curial chair, the bundle of rods with an axe known as the fasces, the solemn procession of officials, and the idea that public rule needed sacred approval. These things were not small decorations. They taught people how to see command before command spoke. A ruler seated above others, a symbol carried before him, a ritual performed in the right order, a boundary marked as sacred, a temple raised on a platform, a city drained and paved for public movement. All of these made authority physical. Since the earliest human groups, power has needed more than force. It has needed signs that the body can recognize: height, distance, sound, clothing, repeated gestures, and places where people gather. The Etruscans understood this in their own cities, and Rome learned near them. Architecture gives another quiet example. The Romans later became famous for roads, aqueducts, arches, sewers, temples, and durable public works, but early Italy already contained skilled builders. Etruscan temples, though known partly through archaeology and later descriptions, had distinctive forms, with raised platforms, deep porches, wide fronts, timber and terracotta decoration, and sacred layouts that differed from Greek stone temples. Etruscan artisans made vivid terracotta roof ornaments and statues. Their builders worked with stone foundations, city walls, drainage systems, and planned sacred spaces. Rome's own early urban growth, including the draining of low ground that became the Forum, belongs to this wider Italic and Etruscan technical environment. It would be too simple to say Rome copied everything. Cultures rarely move that way. They borrow, adapt, combine, and rename. From deep human beginnings, every settlement has grown by taking earlier knowledge and fitting it to new needs. Fire, shelter, paths, burial, walls, tools, and signs of rank all passed through countless hands before they became the property of a state. Rome did the same at a larger scale. Religious practice may show the influence even more clearly. Roman writers themselves associated certain forms of divination, especially reading signs from lightning, birds, and the entrails of sacrificed animals, with Etruscan specialists. The Romans respected Etruscan ritual knowledge, even while later placing it inside Roman institutions. This respect did not save Etruscan independence, but it shows that Rome did not treat Etruria as empty or backward. It took Etruscan forms seriously because they carried authority. That is one of the quiet ironies of erasure. The conquered can survive inside the conqueror's most official gestures. A symbol may become Roman precisely because it was useful before Rome fully owned it. A ritual may continue after the language around it changes. A building habit may outlive the city that first taught it. In this way, Etruscan influence did not disappear when Roman power rose. It was absorbed into Rome's face, into the way Rome looked, moved, prayed, judged, and presented command. Before Rome became the name attached to Italy, it had already learned how authority could be staged in stone, cloth, procession, and sacred silence. Beneath that learning, the older civilization remained visible, not as a footnote, but as one of the hands that shaped Rome's public body itself. Roman tradition remembered a time before the Republic, when kings ruled the city beside the Tiber. Among those kings, the names Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus carry a strong Etruscan sound, and later Romans linked them with the older world north of Rome. These stories matter, but they must be handled with care. The early history of Rome was written down long after the events it claimed to describe, and memory had already been shaped by family pride, political lessons, religious explanation, and the need to give the Republic a meaningful beginning. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, was remembered as a tyrant whose fall opened the way for Roman liberty. That story became central to how Romans explained themselves. It taught that kingship was dangerous, that public rule required limits, and that Rome had once escaped a foreign or overbearing style of power. Yet behind the moral lesson stands a serious historical possibility. Early Rome was deeply connected with Etruscan elites, customs, and political influence. The question is not whether every royal tale happened exactly as later writers told it. The safer question is why Roman memory preserved Etruscan kings at all. A society does not usually place outsiders at the roots of its story unless some old contact left a mark too strong to ignore. From the earliest human communities, origin stories have helped groups explain who they are, where danger came from, and what must never be repeated. They are not simple records, but they are not meaningless either. They hold fears, debts, victories, and warnings in a form that later generations can remember. Rome's royal traditions may work in that way. They do not give us a clear window into every event of the 6th century before the Common Era, but they show that Rome understood its beginning in relation to Etruscan power. Servius Tullius, for example, appears in Roman accounts as a king associated with social ordering, census, tribes, and walls, though the details are debated and wrapped in legend. Tarquinius Priscus is linked with public works, games, and symbols of authority. Tarquinius Superbus becomes the dark image of monarchy itself. These figures may mix real memories, borrowed motifs, and later Roman political teaching. Still, their presence points toward a Rome that was not isolated. It was growing in a zone where Etruscan cities were wealthy, visible, and able to influence neighbours. The royal stories therefore become a bridge between myth and history. Myth, here, does not mean a useless falsehood. It means a remembered pattern shaped into meaning. History asks what can be supported, what can be compared, and where uncertainty must remain. If we confuse the two, we either swallow every legend whole or reject every memory as worthless. A calmer approach lets the stories keep their proper weight. They show that Rome imagined its early transformation through contact with Etruscan forms of rule, ceremony, building, and sacred authority. Across deep human time, growing communities have often borrowed prestige from older neighbours, then later retold that borrowing as destiny, danger, or triumph. A young settlement learns from stronger powers because survival depends on adaptation. Later, when it becomes stronger, it may describe that earlier dependence as a trial it overcame. This pattern is visible in many human pasts, where memory protects pride while quietly preserving dependence, because groups need ancestors, lessons, and boundaries. Rome seems to have done something like this with Etruscan kings. It remembered them as builders and rulers, but also as figures whose fall made Roman freedom possible. In that double memory, respect and rejection stand together. The Etruscans appear near Rome's foundations, yet Roman storytelling keeps them from owning the foundation. This is one of the quiet ways erasure begins. The older influence is admitted, but only inside a story where Rome becomes the final answer, and the earlier voice is softened until it sounds secondary and natural. Rome did not only defeat an older neighbour, it grew inside a world that had already taught central Italy how power could be made visible, how cities could be placed on the land, how sacred signs could guide public action, and how authority could feel older than the men who held it. The Etruscans were among the strongest makers of that world. Their cities, rituals, workshops, tombs, and symbols formed part of the atmosphere in which early Rome learned to breathe. To imagine Rome as pure invention is to miss the deeper human pattern. Since the first settled communities, people have become powerful by receiving what earlier hands had shaped: a path through hills, a method of draining wet ground, a way to mark sacred space, a sign carried before a leader, a rule for reading danger, a memory attached to ancestors. Rome took many such inherited materials and gave them a new direction. This does not reduce Rome's achievement, but it makes that achievement more truthful. Rome became great not because it began from nothing, but because it knew how to gather, discipline, and extend what already existed around it. The Etruscan contribution was not one simple package. It was a surrounding pressure. Rome saw how elite families could use ritual to strengthen command. It saw how public ceremonies could make order feel natural. It saw how temples, walls, drainage works, and formal spaces could turn a settlement into a civic body. It saw how religious specialists could connect human decisions with signs from the sky, from birds, from lightning, and from sacrificed animals. Roman institutions later gave these practices Roman names, Roman offices, and Roman meanings, but the older relationship remained beneath them. A people can be conquered and still live inside the gestures of the conqueror. That is one of the quietest forms of survival, and also one of the hardest to recognize. The fasces could become a Roman emblem. Ritual knowledge could be stored in Roman religious life. Urban techniques could become part of Rome's pride. Royal memories could become warnings inside Roman political identity. In each case, something older remained present, but under another owner's language. Across human history, this happens whenever a younger power absorbs a richer or older neighbour. The younger power may first imitate, then compete, then conquer, and finally describe the inheritance as if it had always belonged to itself. The human body does the same in smaller ways. A child learns a gesture from an elder and later performs it without remembering the first teacher. A village keeps a festival after its first meaning has shifted. A city rebuilds a wall and forgets who first marked the line. Rome's rise worked through a larger version of that process. It did not simply destroy Etruscan forms, it reorganized many of them inside Roman expansion. This is why the question of erasure is so delicate. If erasure meant total absence, then the Etruscans were not erased. Their tombs remain, their inscriptions remain, their influence remains in Roman memory, religion, and public symbolism. But if erasure means the loss of the right to explain oneself, then their fate becomes clearer. Rome became the voice that told the story of Italy. Rome named the lessons, judged the kings, preserved the useful rituals, and placed Etruscan power behind Roman destiny. The older civilization became visible mainly where Roman history allowed it to be visible, or where the ground protected what writing did not. Before Rome surpassed them, the Etruscans had already shaped the grammar of power in Italy. They showed how wealth, ritual, city life, and sacred authority could hold communities together. Rome learned that grammar, then used it to write a longer and louder sentence. The contraction of Etruscan power did not begin as a single collapse. It began as pressure from several directions, some military, some economic, some political, and some almost invisible at first. The Etruscan cities had once stood in a strong position across central Italy and beyond, connected to land routes, coastlines, mineral zones, and Mediterranean trade. But no landscape holds the same advantage forever. Routes change, rivals learn, harbours rise or decline in importance, alliances shift. A city that was once safely placed between fields, roads, and sea lanes can slowly find that the same roads now carry danger closer to its gates. To the south, Rome became the most persistent pressure. At first, Rome was only one neighbour among many, but over generations it developed a political and military system able to return after defeat, form alliances, demand obligations, and keep expanding its reach. Etruscan cities such as Veii stood close enough to Rome for rivalry to become unavoidable. The long struggle between Rome and Veii, remembered in Roman tradition and supported in broad outline by the historical importance of that conflict, shows that this was not a distant cultural fading. It was also a contest over land, roots, status, and survival. Yet Rome was not the only force around Etruria. Other Italic peoples pressed across the peninsula in their own ways. In the north, Celtic groups eventually affected the balance of power in the Po Valley. In the south and along the sea, Greek and Carthaginian interests shaped trade and warfare. The Etruscan world had been strong, partly because it was connected. Later, those same connections exposed it to competition. This is a familiar human pattern. From the earliest communities, survival depended on movement and contact, but every path that brought food, mates, tools, and news could also bring conflict. A river is a gift until an enemy follows it. A coast is an opening until another fleet arrives. A trade object is wealth until another producer controls the route. In Etruria, the old balance between opportunity and danger began to tilt. Military pressure weakened some cities. Maritime competition limited older influence in some coastal networks. Internal rivalry made unified response difficult. A city could defend its own fields while another faced a different threat. A network that had once allowed flexibility now struggled against rivals that could act with greater coordination or greater force. Rome's expansion was especially important because it did not merely raid and leave, it made conquest durable. It built roads, secured alliances, founded colonies, and tied defeated communities into obligations that served Roman growth. This was different from the older Etruscan pattern of powerful cities standing beside one another. Rome turned victory into structure. It could absorb a place and then use that place as part of the next stage of expansion. Over time, this changed the political weather of Italy. Etruscan cities did not all weaken in the same year or for the same reason. Some remained wealthy and culturally active for a long time. Some adapted to Roman influence before losing full independence. Some kept local traditions while accepting Roman political realities. The decline was therefore not a clean fall from greatness into emptiness. It was a long narrowing of choices. In deep human history, groups often disappear from power before they disappear from life. People continue to farm, marry, bury, trade, pray, and teach children, even as the larger name over them changes. That is what makes the Etruscan story so quiet and so difficult. Their world did not end because it had no roots. It weakened because the surrounding forces changed, and because Rome learned how to turn pressure into permanence. The cities that had once helped define Italy before Rome now faced a neighbour able to take their roads, their alliances, their sacred prestige, and their land, then fold them into a new order that would remember the Etruscans less as rulers than as something Rome had overcome. The weakness of the Etruscan city network became clearer as Rome learned how to make its victories last. An Etruscan city could be wealthy, proud, and well-placed, yet still stand for itself when pressure came. Its first duty was to its own fields, families, temples, walls, and dead. Its leaders had to think about harvests, trade routes, neighbouring rivals, and the balance of local families before they could think about a united Etruscan future. That was not foolish. It was how many ancient city societies worked. Local memory was strong because life itself was local. From the earliest human communities, people survived by trusting what they knew closely. The spring that did not fail, the hill that gave warning, the kin group that shared food, the burial place that fixed belonging to the soil. Even when settlements grew into cities, that old attachment remained under politics. Etruria was rich in such attachments. Each city had its own sacred places, ancestral tombs, workshops, roads, and pride. Together they formed a civilization, but they did not always form one will. Rome's strength grew in the space between those wills. When Rome fought one neighbour, it often tried to prevent other neighbours from becoming one front. When it defeated a community, it did not always destroy it completely. More often, over time, Rome turned defeat into a relationship. Treaty, tribute, military service, alliance, colony, road, legal obligation, or a reduced form of belonging. This made Roman expansion cumulative. One victory helped prepare the next. One absorbed town could supply men, grain, position, or information for a later campaign. The Etruscan cities had influence across a wide cultural field, but Rome increasingly built a political field that could be directed from one centre. That difference changed the meaning of time. For a city network, time could scatter effort. Each crisis belonged first to the city most directly touched by it. For Rome, time could be stored. A road remained useful after a war ended. A treaty continued to bind a defeated ally. A colony guarded a route for the future. A census could organize bodies and property into public use. A military obligation could turn many local lives toward one expanding purpose. This was not a sudden miracle of Roman greatness. It was a long discipline of organization, built across generations, harsh, practical, and often learned from the very world Rome was absorbing. The Etruscans had shown how urban prestige, ritual authority, and local wealth could shape central Italy. Rome learned how to connect such things into a system that moved outward. Human history often turns on this quiet change, the movement from many remembered places to one structure that can command many places. The Etruscan cities kept their depth, but Rome gained reach. Depth can preserve identity. Reach can change the map. As Rome grew, Etruscan independence was not crushed everywhere at once. The narrowing came unevenly. A city might keep its language in inscriptions while accepting Roman power in politics. A family might preserve old names while joining Roman alliances. A temple ritual might continue while the authority around it changed. A workshop might still produce objects in a local style, while roads and obligations tied the city more closely to Rome. This is why cultural life can survive while political freedom fades. People do not stop being themselves on the day a treaty is signed or a wall falls. They continue in households, fields, markets, and graves. But their children may learn another public language. Their elites may seek status in another system. Their gods may be translated into another order. Their memories may become local, while someone else's history becomes universal. The Etruscan network had once allowed many cities to shine. Against Rome's gathering structure, that same network became lights dimmed one by one, until the older sky of Italy was remembered mainly by the people who replaced it. Etruscan decline was not a door closing in one night. It was more like a road slowly changing direction, while the people walking it still believed they were moving through familiar ground. A city could lose a battle and continue to hold markets. A family could bury its dead with older customs while its sons served under Roman obligations. A local leader could keep status at home while learning to speak the language of Roman power. A sanctuary could remain sacred, even as the political world around it no longer belonged fully to Etruria. This is why the fall of Etruscan independence is difficult to feel as one dramatic moment. It unfolded through war, treaties, shifting alliances, loss of territory, legal changes, and practical adaptation. Some cities resisted Rome fiercely, others negotiated, some entered Roman orbit gradually, some preserved recognizable Etruscan identity for generations after political control had narrowed. The map changed faster than memory, and memory changed faster than blood. From the earliest human communities, survival has often required this kind of adjustment. People have always stayed alive not only by defending old boundaries, but by learning when a boundary can no longer hold. A group may keep its burial place, its family names, its household gestures, and its local gods, while accepting a new ruler, a new tax, a new military duty, or a new public language. That does not feel like disappearance from inside the household. It may feel like compromise, caution, or simply the way children must now live. But across generations, such compromises can become a deep historical transformation. In Etruria, Rome's advance slowly turned neighbouring cities into dependent communities, then allies, then parts of a Roman order. Each step could seem limited when it happened. A treaty might preserve local life, a road might bring trade as well as soldiers. Roman citizenship, when extended in stages, could offer status while also drawing people away from older civic identities. Land arrangements could reward some families and weaken others. Military service could bind young men to campaigns far beyond their ancestral hills. Latin could become the language of advancement, law, and public record, while Etruscan remained closer to local memory and ritual. None of this required every Etruscan person to vanish. It required only that the larger system in which they lived stop speaking mainly in their name. This is one of the quiet mechanisms of erasure in human history. A people may survive biologically, socially, and even culturally in fragments, while their public story is taken over by another power. The old cities still stood. The tombs still held the dead. The fields still needed hands. Mothers still taught children household habits. Artisans still shaped objects. Priests and ritual specialists may have continued older knowledge in narrowed settings. Yet the horizon had changed. Rome became the place where ambition pointed. Roman law became the frame that mattered more each generation. Roman wars became the wars that organized men's lives. Roman memory became the memory that later writers preserved. The Etruscan world did not fail because it lacked depth. It faded as depth became local and Roman reach became universal. In the long beginning of humanity, culture was never fixed in stone alone. It lived in repeated action. How to speak to elders, how to mark a grave, how to trade, how to marry, how to name a child, how to stand before sacred signs. When those repeated actions move into another language and another political order, the old culture can continue and disappear at the same time. That was the slow Etruscan ending. Not a single destruction, not an emptying of the land, but a long passage in which war opened the way, alliances tightened the path, lost land, reduced freedom, and adaptation allowed life to go on, under a name that was no longer theirs. Conquest did not arrive in Etruria as one clean line drawn across the map. It moved city by city, treaty by treaty, fear by fear, until older centres that had once looked outward with confidence began to turn toward Rome as the force they could no longer ignore. Veii, standing close to Rome, became an early and powerful example of that nearness turning into danger. Its fall did not mean that every Etruscan city fell at the same moment, but it showed that Rome could overcome a major neighbour and hold the result. After that, other cities faced their own choices under a changing sky. Tarquinia, Caere, Vulci, Volsinii, Perusia, and others did not all share one fate at one time. Some resisted with arms, some made agreements, some lost land. Some entered alliances that preserved daily life while reducing political freedom. What had once been a broad Etruscan world slowly became a series of local relationships with Rome. This is how many human communities have passed from independence into absorption. From the earliest villages, people have known that survival may require more than fighting. It may require waiting, bargaining, moving a boundary, giving a son to another army, learning another tongue, or accepting that the old hill remains home even when command now comes from elsewhere. For an Etruscan family, Roman expansion may not have felt at first like the disappearance of a civilization. The fields still needed planting, the dead still lay in familiar tombs, markets still opened, marriages still joined households, craftsmen still shaped metal and clay, priests still watched signs and remembered ritual practice. Yet above these ordinary continuities, the public frame was changing. Rome's power did not only defeat walls, it rearranged obligation. A city tied to Rome might supply soldiers, accept Roman arbitration, obey new legal limits, or support Roman campaigns. Roads and colonies drew the land into Roman movement. Local elites could find advantage by cooperating with Rome, while those who resisted might lose rank, property, or security. Across generations, these choices changed what ambition looked like. A young man from an old Etruscan city might still know the name of his ancestors, but the path to wider status increasingly passed through Roman institutions. A family might keep older memories at home, yet use Latin more often where law, trade, and office required it. Such changes are quiet because they do not always break the body. They change the direction in which a life must face. In the long history of our species, belonging has always had layers. The body belongs to a family, the family to a place, the place to a wider order. When that widest order changes, the inner layers may continue for a time, but their meanings slowly adjust. Etruscan cities were drawn into Rome in exactly that layered way. They were not emptied at once. They were reclassified, bound, used, and remembered differently. Their people could become allies, subjects, or eventually citizens within a Roman world. Their old city names might survive, but the power behind those names weakened. Their religious expertise could be valued, even as Roman authorities controlled the setting in which it mattered. Their tombs could remain sacred to families, even as public history began to call the future Roman. This is why being conquered is not the same as vanishing. It is often the beginning of a slower transformation, where the streets still carry familiar feet, but the law above the streets speaks in another voice. Etruria entered Rome's orbit not as dust, but as living cities pulled gradually into a stronger gravity. Over time, the old question of who ruled a city became less important than whose calendar, courts, roads, and armies organized its days. That was not instant erasure. It was the patient redirection of memory until Etruscan life continued inside a map increasingly named by Rome and guarded by Roman power. The people of Etruscan cities did not cease to exist when Roman power entered their walls. They kept living in houses, walking to fields, trading in markets, burying relatives, teaching children, repairing tools, and honouring old places whose meanings were older than the new political order. Conquest changes maps more quickly than it changes bodies. A family may wake the morning after a treaty or defeat and still need bread, water, fuel, work, and care for the sick and young. In that ordinary continuation, Etruscan life remained real long after independence narrowed. What changed was the frame around that life. Roman authority became the road through which law, military duty, public ambition, and wider security increasingly passed. Some Etruscan families adapted by joining Roman systems. Local elites could cooperate with Roman officials, serve in Roman causes, and seek honour in a world where the old city alone no longer decided status. Over time, many people from Etruscan communities learned Latin, used Roman legal forms, took Roman names, or moved within Roman networks of trade and obligation. This was not a simple replacement of one population by another. It was a gradual reorientation of identity. A person could descend from Etruscan families, live in an old Etruscan city, and still become part of Rome's civic and military world. Human belonging has always worked in layers. Since the earliest human groups, a person has belonged first to a body, then to a household, then to a remembered place, then to a wider group that gives protection, marriage ties, exchange, or command. When the widest layer changes, the inner layers do not disappear at once. They continue, but they begin to answer to a different sky. In Etruria, that sky became Roman. Children may have grown up hearing older names in family memory, while also learning the language that opened public doors. Burial habits may have preserved local echoes while Roman forms entered clothing, inscriptions, law, and status. Craftsmen may have continued older skills while producing for buyers whose taste was now shaped by a larger Roman world. Priests and ritual specialists may have kept Etruscan knowledge alive, especially because Romans themselves valued certain Etruscan forms of divination. Yet that knowledge survived increasingly under Roman supervision and Roman explanation. This is how absorption can preserve and weaken at the same time. It keeps people alive, but it moves the center of meaning elsewhere. Trade also helped the transformation. Roads, colonies, military routes, and Roman markets tied old Etruscan communities to a peninsula that was becoming more unified under Roman control. Goods moved through wider channels. Men served in wider wars. Families sought advantage through wider connections. The local horizon did not vanish, but it was no longer enough by itself. A young person's future could be measured not only by standing in Tarquinia, Volsinii, or Perusia, but by usefulness inside the Roman order. Across deep human history, this pattern has repeated whenever a strong political system expands over older societies. The older people remain, but their children learn new public habits because survival and advancement require them. A mother can teach a household memory while the state teaches another language. A grandfather can remember older rituals while a magistrate records a Latin name. A tomb can hold the dead of one culture while the living sign documents in the language of another. None of these moments is dramatic enough to look like erasure by itself. Together, across generations, they change what a civilization can say aloud. The Etruscans continued through bodies, families, customs, religious traces, and local pride, but Rome became the name that organized the future. Their blood did not vanish. Their cities did not all fall silent. Their hands did not stop working. What faded was the independent public voice that could tell the world, in its own language, what all of that life meant. To say that the Etruscans were erased is not to say that every Etruscan body disappeared from Italy. That would be a false and careless picture. The deeper change was slower, and in some ways more complete because it did not require emptiness. People remained in the old cities. Families continued through marriage and descent. Fields were cultivated. Local shrines were visited. Objects were made, traded, repaired, and handed down. But the public language of belonging changed around them. Latin gained weight where Etruscan had once carried names, offices, dedications, and memory. Roman law became the frame within which disputes, rights, duties, land, and status were increasingly defined. Roman military service tied local men to campaigns and commanders beyond the older horizon of Etruria. Roman roads and colonies made movement answer to a new centre. Over time, the civilization that had once stood as one of Italy's leading powers became part of the Roman population, Roman administration, and Roman story. This is why conquest can be difficult to see from inside ordinary life. A person may still eat familiar food, walk a familiar road, and honor familiar dead, while the larger name over that life is changing. From the earliest human communities, identity has always lived through repeated acts. The words a child hears, the places a family returns to, the gestures used at burial, the rules for marriage, the signs of rank, the stories that explain why one group is not another. When those acts begin to pass through another language and another political order, the body survives, but the older collective voice becomes thinner. In Etruria, this thinning did not happen evenly. Some inscriptions in the Etruscan language continued for a time. Some rituals and family memories persisted. Roman writers still recognized Etruscan religious expertise, especially in forms of divination. Certain noble families of Etruscan origin entered Roman public life, carrying old ancestry into new status. Yet each survival also shows the change. What remained was increasingly preserved inside Roman conditions. An Etruscan ritual could be respected, but explained by Roman authors. An Etruscan family could rise, but within Roman offices. An old city could continue, but as a community inside Rome's political world, the old name was not always forbidden. It was made smaller. That may be one of the most common endings in human history. Many peoples are not erased by fire alone, but by translation, absorption, and the gradual loss of the institutions that let them speak for themselves. A language may first retreat from public law into household memory, then into ritual, then into a few names on stone. A local identity may first remain proud, then become regional, then become ancestry, then become a curiosity described by others. The Etruscans show this process with unusual clarity, because their material remains are rich while their long-written voice is scarce. The tombs, walls, and objects keep saying that they existed. The surviving historical frame keeps reminding us that Rome became the louder witness. This is not the same as total disappearance, but it is a real loss. It is the loss of being the central narrator of one's own world. In the long beginning of our species, memory belonged to those who repeated it around fires, graves, paths, and homes. Later, states learned to store memory in archives, laws, public monuments, and official histories. Rome became powerful in that later way. 1. It could absorb people and then arrange the record so that absorption looked like destiny. The Etruscans lived on in descendants, practices, symbols, and places, but the meaning of their survival was increasingly written by someone else. Even their nearness to Rome made the loss quieter, because the older world did not look foreign enough to be preserved as fully separate. That is how a civilization can remain underfoot, visible in stone and ancestry, while still being erased from the front of the story. History often follows the paper that survives. Rome became the stronger voice not only because it conquered widely, but because its language, institutions, and writers carried memory forward in forms that later generations could read, copy, teach, and admire. Latin texts preserved wars, laws, political conflicts, moral lessons, family traditions, and explanations of origin. Even when Roman writers disagreed, exaggerated, or shaped the past to serve later needs, they left a dense record. The Etruscans left something different. They left cities, tombs, inscriptions, objects, ritual traces, and influence inside Roman life, but far fewer long texts that explain their world from their own point of view. Their language is not wholly unreadable, and many inscriptions can be understood at the level of names, relationships, dedications, and certain formulas. Yet the kind of broad historical voice that Rome preserved is mostly absent. That imbalance matters because later memory is not built only from what happened. It is built from what can be repeated. From the earliest human communities, memory depended on repetition around bodies and places. A path walked again, a grave visited again, a story told again, a child taught the same name for a hill or river. When states grew larger, repetition moved into writing, archives, monuments, schools, laws, and public ceremonies. A people whose records were copied could remain present long after its cities changed. A people whose explanations were not copied could become dependent on others to describe them. This is part of what happened to the Etruscans. Their material remains are strong enough to prove complexity, wealth, skill, and influence. But Rome's surviving words became the main frame through which many later readers met them. Roman authors could remember Etruscan kings, religious experts, luxurious customs, foreign habits, ancient rituals, or defeated cities. They could respect Etruscan knowledge and still place it under Roman meaning. They could admit an older debt while shaping that debt into a story of Roman destiny. The result is subtle. The Etruscans are not forgotten, but they are often remembered in positions chosen by others. They appear as teachers of ritual, as former rulers, as rivals near Rome's beginning, as people of strange customs, as sources of old authority, or as names attached to places and families. Rarely do they stand as the full centre of Italy's early story. This is how power continues after battle. A victorious state does not only take land, it decides which memories become large and which become local. It decides what children are taught to admire, which language carries lore, which ancestors become examples, and which older peoples become background. In deep human history, every group has needed a way to protect memory from death. At first, memory lived in living mouths and repeated gestures. Later, writing allowed memory to travel beyond the body, but writing also created inequality among the dead. Those who left many readable words could speak more loudly across time than those who left mostly objects and short inscriptions. The Etruscans suffer from that inequality. Their tombs are rich, but tombs do not argue like histories. Their objects are eloquent, but objects cannot easily correct an outsider's judgment. Their inscriptions preserve names, but names alone cannot rebuild every public debate, fear, policy, or hope. Rome's record, by contrast, kept arranging the past into lessons. It could turn the fall of kings into a lesson about liberty. It could turn Etruscan ritual knowledge into Roman religious tradition. It could turn conquest into the natural growth of Rome. None of this means Roman sources are worthless. They are essential, but they must be read as voices, with interests, pride, memory, and distance. To understand why the Etruscans seem erased, we have to see that erasure can begin when one archive becomes larger than another. Before Rome ruled memory, the Etruscans had ruled parts of the living landscape. After Rome ruled memory, their world survived most clearly where stone, paint, bronze, and earth could speak without sentences. The Etruscans did have writing, and this simple fact should protect them from being described as a people without language or record. Their inscriptions appear on tombs, mirrors, pottery, boundary markers, religious objects, and personal items. Their alphabet was adapted from Greek models, and their language can be sounded out by scholars with considerable confidence. Many personal names, family relations, titles, dedications, and repeated formulas are understood, yet the surviving record is uneven. What is missing is not writing itself, but the long continuous voice that would let us hear Etruscan authors explain their cities, their laws, their memories, their conflicts, or their view of Rome. A civilization can leave thousands of marks and still remain difficult to hear if most of those marks are brief. A name on a tomb says that a person belonged to a family and a place. A dedication says that an offering was made. A ritual text may preserve sacred language. But these fragments do not give us the same kind of narrative that Roman historians later produced in Latin. They do not tell us, in broad flowing accounts, how Etruscan communities understood their own rise, their alliances, their losses, or their absorption into another world. This is why the Etruscan silence is not absolute, but partial. It is a silence made of short voices rather than no voices. That distinction matters because it keeps the story honest. The Etruscans were not mute. Time has simply spared more of their labels, names, and ritual traces than their explanations. From the earliest human life, memory has always depended on the material that could carry it. A spoken story may live only while someone repeats it. A mark on stone may last longer, but it may say less. A wooden tablet, a folded cloth, a painted surface, or a book can vanish through fire, damp, reuse, neglect, or conquest. Human beings have always trusted fragile things with meaning, and fragile things often fail. Etruscan writing suffered from that larger human vulnerability. Some texts may have been placed on materials that did not survive. Some may have been destroyed when cities changed hands. Some may never have existed in the volume later readers wish for. The result is the same. Rome left a library of memory, while Etruria left a landscape of shorter signs. The contrast shaped everything that followed. Roman writers could describe Etruscan religion, customs, and royal memory, but they did so in Roman language and often for Roman purposes. The Etruscans could still appear in those pages, yet they appeared as seen from outside or from after the fact. Their own written reply is mostly unavailable. This does not mean we know nothing. Archaeology, inscriptions, comparative study, and ancient testimony together allow a careful picture. Urban communities, elite families, trade, ritual authority, distinctive burial customs, political division, and gradual incorporation into Rome. But the missing long texts leave gaps at the level of motive, emotion, public debate, and self-description. We do not hear an Etruscan city explaining why it fought, negotiated, mourned, adapted, or remembered. We see the tomb after the funeral, the name after the voice, the object after the hand. In that gap, erasure becomes more than conquest. It becomes a failure of transmission. The people lived, the cities stood, the language was written. But the channels that might have carried Etruscan thought forward were broken, narrowed, or overshadowed. Rome did not need to burn every record for Roman memory to become dominant. It only needed to become the system through which later generations learned to ask questions. When the questions are Roman, even the older answers begin to sound distant. The Etruscans remain present in inscriptions, but the long conversation that would have placed those inscriptions inside their own world is mostly gone. When Rome looked backward across early Italy, it did not see the past from a place of innocence. It saw the past from victory. The Etruscans could be remembered, but the shape of that memory was usually Roman. They appeared as old kings near Rome's beginning, as experts in sacred signs, as wealthy neighbours, as dangerous rivals, as sources of ceremony, and as defeated cities folded into a greater destiny. In such a story, they were allowed to matter, but rarely allowed to stand at the centre for long. Rome could admit that Etruscan influence had touched its symbols, rituals, and early urban life, while still arranging the larger movement so that Rome seemed like the natural result of everything before it. This is how inheritance can become hidden. What is received from an older world is not denied completely. It is renamed, organised, and placed under the authority of the younger power that survived more loudly. From the earliest human communities, groups have shaped identity by remembering some ancestors clearly and letting others fade into the background. A child learns which graves to visit, which names to repeat, which old stories explain belonging, and which neighbouring people are treated as outsiders. Larger states do the same thing with greater force. They build temples, write histories, preserve laws, celebrate victories, and teach a public memory that makes their rise seem coherent. Rome was especially powerful at this. It could absorb older peoples and then make their survival appear as one more step in Roman growth. The Etruscans were useful to that memory because they explained both origin and contrast. As origin, they helped account for early kingship, religious knowledge, symbols of command, and forms of urban dignity. As contrast, they helped Rome define what it claimed to have overcome: monarchy, foreign influence, luxury, division, and old local power. This double role kept them visible but contained. They became close enough to be ancestors, distant enough to be others, respected enough to lend authority, and defeated enough not to challenge the Roman centre. That is one of the most delicate forms of erasure. It does not require forgetting a people entirely. It requires remembering them only in shapes that serve another people's self-image. The Etruscans were not erased from every monument, every family line, or every ritual trace. They were erased from the main position of explanation. Their cities became earlier scenes in a Roman drama. Their religious specialists became part of Roman religious vocabulary. Their kings became warnings in a Roman story about liberty. Their art and tombs became evidence that later readers had to interpret through archaeology because the longer Etruscan account was missing. In deep human history, memory has always been uneven in this way. The hand that holds the story can make one life into an example and another into a footnote. The group that controls public time can decide where history begins. Rome made Italy's past begin again under Roman meaning. Etruscan civilization remained underneath that meaning, like an older road paved over but still guiding the line of travel. The stones were still there, and sometimes the surface cracked enough for them to be seen. But the traveller was taught to call the road Roman. This is why the title's question is not only about destruction, it is about control over memory. Before Rome, the Etruscans helped shape the peninsula's cities, rituals, trade, and signs of authority. After Rome, much of that shaping survived as Roman inheritance. Their presence did not disappear from the ground. It disappeared from the front of the story, where a civilization once able to influence Italy became an earlier shadow inside the history of the power that absorbed it. Looking back across the older Italy beneath Rome, the Etruscan story no longer appears as a sudden mystery, but as a long movement from strength into absorption. It began with land, hills above valleys, rivers leading toward the sea, fields that could feed cities, forests that could provide timber, and mineral zones where skilled hands turned ore into useful and meaningful objects. From that ground grew a network of cities, each with its own pride and memory, yet joined by language, ritual habits, artistic forms, trade, and shared ways of honouring rank. Before Rome became the voice that later centuries heard most clearly, Etruscan communities had already shaped central Italy through work that was practical, sacred, and social at the same time. They built walls, drained wet places, raised temples, watched signs, exchanged goods across the Mediterranean, and placed the dead in tombs that could resemble houses under the earth. Their civilization was not an empty prelude. It was a full human world, made by farmers, artisans, traders, families, leaders, servants, sailors, priests, and children, all living inside the old human task of turning a dangerous landscape into a place that could hold memory. Since the beginning of our species, that task has remained nearly unchanged beneath every empire. Human beings seek water, food, shelter, kin, signs of belonging, and some way to keep the dead from vanishing at once. The Etruscans answered those needs in forms that were their own. Their painted tombs, metalwork, inscriptions, and city sites show not fantasy, but organized life. They show wealth, skill, hierarchy, contact, devotion, and the quiet wish to be remembered. Then Rome grew beside them. At first, Rome was only one settlement within a crowded peninsula. It learned near older powers, borrowed from them, competed with them, and slowly developed a different kind of strength. Etruscan cities could shine as separate centres. Rome learned how to turn separate centres into a widening system. War mattered, but war was only one tool. Treaties, roads, colonies, obligations, law, citizenship, and public memory made Roman expansion durable. One Etruscan city might resist while another negotiated. One family might preserve old names while entering Roman life. One ritual might continue while its explanation became Roman. In this gradual process, the Etruscans were not erased like marks wiped from a tablet in a single motion. They were drawn into another order until their independence, language, and public self-description became thinner across generations. That is why their remains feel both abundant and incomplete. The ground still speaks through tombs, walls, tools, mirrors, vessels, and names. Roman tradition still admits their influence in kingship, ritual, symbols of authority, and early urban life. Yet the long Etruscan voice that might have explained all of this from within is mostly missing. The result is a civilization still visible in evidence, but often placed behind the story of the power that absorbed it. In deep human history, such losses are common. A people may survive through descendants, habits, gestures, and places, while the name that once joined those things fades from the wider world. A conquered city may keep its streets, while its future is written in another language. A sacred practice may continue, while later generations remember it as belonging to the state that preserved it, not the people who shaped it first. This is not only an ancient Italian problem, it belongs to the way human memory works whenever power changes hands. The body can carry ancestry longer than law can carry freedom. The hand can repeat an old gesture after the word for that gesture has been forgotten. The ground can keep a people near after public history has moved them aside. The Etruscans stand at that quiet threshold. They were rulers, neighbours, teachers, rivals, and finally subjects within the Roman world. Their story reminds us that a civilization can be present in the foundations of history and still be missing from the doorway. The lesson of the Etruscans is not that civilizations are fragile, only when armies break their walls. Walls can fall, and yet people may remain. Temples can lose their public authority, and yet gestures may continue in smaller places. A language can retreat from law into names, then from names into memory, then from memory into silence, while families still carry bodies, habits, and ancestry forward. Many civilizations do not end like a lamp suddenly blown out. They end more often like a voice moving farther down a hallway, still present for a while, still recognizable to those nearby, but harder for later listeners to hear. The Etruscans show this slow fading with unusual clarity because they were both powerful and absorbed. They were not a lost people invented by rumour. They were builders of cities, workers of metal, makers of tombs, traders across the sea, keepers of rituals, and neighbours whose influence reached early Rome. Yet when Roman power expanded, the name of the future changed. The old cities entered new obligations. The public language shifted. Local elites found status in Roman forms. Sacred knowledge survived under Roman supervision. Family memory remained close to the ground, while empire moved the horizon outward. From the earliest human beginnings, this tension has always existed between the small circle and the larger order. Human beings first learned belonging through face, touch, food, shelter, and repeated paths. A child knew the people who fed him, the ground where fires were lit, the place where the dead were remembered. Later, cities and states stretched belonging beyond the visible circle. They gave people wider protection, wider danger, wider ambition, and wider names. When a larger name absorbs a smaller one, something is gained and something is lost. The gain may be security, roads, law, markets, and a place inside a powerful world. The loss may be the ability to explain life in one's own inherited terms. Etruria's passage into Rome holds both sides. It was not only defeat, it was also adaptation. People continued because life demands continuation. Crops cannot wait for political certainty. Children must still be raised. Graves must still be tended. Work must still be done. This is why history should be careful with the word erased. It should not be used as a cheap claim that no one survived. It should be used, if at all, for the quieter loss of independent memory. A civilization is deeply wounded when its own account of itself no longer travels forward with the same strength as its roads, tools, descendants, or borrowed rituals. The Etruscans left enough to prove they mattered, but not enough to let them fully answer Rome in their own long voice. That imbalance is the moral centre of their story. It teaches that power does not only decide who wins a war, it also decides whose version of the past becomes ordinary. Across world history, many older societies have lived on beneath the names of those who conquered, married into, translated, or reorganized them. Their foods remain, their local words remain, their building habits remain, their bloodlines remain, but the front of the story belongs elsewhere. For older listeners, this lesson is especially gentle, because human life itself is made of inheritance. We all carry words we did not invent, gestures we learned before we understood them, and memories shaped by people no longer present to explain. The Etruscans ask us to notice those hidden continuities, without pretending that continuity removes loss. Survival is not the opposite of erasure. Sometimes survival is the form erasure takes, because people keep living while the name that once gathered them becomes smaller with every generation. Rome did not rise from empty ground. It rose from a crowded human inheritance and became strong enough to call that inheritance Roman. The lesson is simple and quiet. When we study the past, we should ask not only what disappeared, but who taught the survivors how to remember. If the Etruscans had vanished completely, their story would be simpler, but less true. The more difficult truth is that they remained in many forms while losing the position from which they could explain themselves. Their old cities did not become empty air. Their descendants did not disappear from the peninsula. Their ritual knowledge did not leave Rome untouched. Their symbols, building habits, family names, sacred practices, and ideas of public authority did not stop at the boundary of conquest. Some of them passed into Roman life so deeply that later generations could forget the older hand that had shaped them. This is why the Etruscan ending feels less like a death and more like a transformation that cost them their name. A road can still be walked after its first builders are forgotten. A ceremony can still be performed after its first language has faded. A city can still stand after the map has been redrawn around it. Human history is full of this quiet survival. Since the earliest communities, people have lived by receiving more than they knew they were receiving. A child learns a word without knowing the first mouth that spoke it. A family keeps a gesture because an elder once taught it. A village repeats a custom after its first purpose has softened. A civilization inherits walls, roots, sacred signs, and forms of power, then calls them its own because memory has grown around the new name. Rome did this on a scale large enough to change the world. It gathered older Italian landscapes into one expanding order. It took Etruscan cities into its alliances, its wars, its legal frame, and finally its imagination of destiny. In that process, Rome became louder than the people who had helped prepare the stage on which Rome rose. The lesson is not to blame Rome, as if history were a simple trial between innocence and guilt. Rome was also a human society, shaped by fear, ambition, discipline, borrowing, violence, compromise, and the need to survive among rivals. The lesson is quieter. It is that power changes not only who rules, but how the past is arranged afterward. Once Rome became the main storyteller, the Etruscans were remembered through Roman categories: former kings, ritual experts, wealthy neighbours, defeated rivals, useful ancestors, strange others. They were still visible, but not fully on their own terms. Archaeology gives them some of that weight back. Tombs, inscriptions, walls, objects, and painted chambers remind us that before Rome ruled Italy's memory, Etruscan people had already made homes, raised cities, honoured the dead, shaped metal, crossed seas, and taught parts of Italy how authority could look and feel. These traces do not answer everything, and they should not be forced to do so. Their silence is part of their truth. A truthful history does not fill every silence with invention. It allows absence to remain visible. It admits that the past is not a possession but a careful approach. For the listener, the value of this story may be simple. When we look at any great civilization, we should look beneath its surface for the older lives it absorbed. No empire rises from empty ground. No language carries only itself. No monument is built by memory alone. Under every famous name, there are smaller names, older hands, forgotten teachers, and people whose world continues only because someone else carried it forward without always remembering why. The Etruscans were not only erased, they were also preserved in altered form, scattered through Rome's roads. Rituals, symbols, families, and habits of command. Their loss and their survival are not opposites. They are two sides of the same human process. And so, when an older civilization lives on inside the power that replaced it, but can no longer speak in its own full voice, should we call that disappearance or another way of existing?